Driving through the expansive highways of the Midwest, particularly at night, can feel like traversing an endless void. On one such drive, in the spring of 2023, I experienced something so strange and terrifying that I still struggle to piece it together. I was traveling from Sioux Falls to Des Moines for a family gathering, a drive that would take me through miles of flat farmland and isolated stretches of road. It was a trip I'd made several times before, so I thought nothing of leaving late in the evening, planning to arrive just after midnight. The first half of the drive was uneventful. The open road, the faint glow of the dashboard, and my favorite playlist kept me company. The moon hung low, casting its pale light across the fields. But as the clock ticked past 11 p.m., the atmosphere began to shift. The highway grew quieter, the occasional passing car becoming a distant memory. The tall grass lining the road swayed unnaturally, as if caught in an invisible current. That's when I saw her. Standing on the shoulder, illuminated by my headlights, was a young woman. She was barefoot, wearing a simple white dress that looked out of place against the dark, dusty backdrop of the highway. Her long hair was tangled, her posture stiff as she stared straight ahead. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. As I passed her, she turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were piercing, almost too bright, reflecting the light like an animal's. Against my better judgment, I pulled over a short distance ahead and rolled down the window. "Do you need help?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. She didn't respond right away, but after a moment, she nodded. Her movements were slow and deliberate, as if each step took effort. She climbed into the passenger seat without a word, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "Home," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. Her face was pale, her expression vacant. She clutched a small, worn bag to her chest, her knuckles white against the fabric. The air in the car felt heavy, the silence between us stretching unbearably. After a few miles, she finally spoke again. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice distant. "Most people don't." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Why wouldn't they?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to look at me, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "I need you to take the next exit," she said suddenly, her tone firm. I hesitated. According to the GPS, the next exit led to an abandoned rest stop. "There's nothing there," I said. "Please," she insisted, her voice rising. Reluctantly, I complied, the tires crunching against gravel as I pulled into the empty lot. The rest stop was derelict, its windows boarded up and its sign faded beyond recognition. She opened the door and stepped out, turning to face me. "This is far enough," she said, her expression unreadable. Before I could protest, she closed the door and began walking toward the building. "Wait," I called out, stepping out of the car. She turned, her eyes locking onto mine. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and urgent. I froze, confusion and fear washing over me. Without another word, she disappeared around the corner of the building. I hesitated, debating whether to follow her. But as I approached the rest stop, a sound stopped me in my tracks, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on glass. I peered into the darkness, my heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and then I saw it. In the broken window of the rest stop, a face stared back at me. It wasn't hers. It was pale, distorted, its eyes sunken and empty. The mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, its teeth unnaturally sharp. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled back to the car. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The lights of the rest stop flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw her standing in the doorway, her expression solemn. Behind her, the distorted figure loomed, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached Des Moines, the adrenaline coursing through my veins keeping me awake. To this day, I don't know who or what I picked up that night, but every time I see someone on the side of the highway, I think twice before stopping. Night drives can be strangely meditative. a blend of rhythm and solitude that lulls you into a trance. But sometimes, that isolation becomes suffocating. One night in the fall of 2022, I experienced the kind of isolation that turns into terror, a nightmare I still can't explain. I was driving home to Albuquerque from a work event in Amarillo. The stretch of highway between the two cities was long and barren, cutting through desolate desert landscapes with barely a town in sight. It was close to 11 p.m. when I left Amarillo, and my plan was to drive straight through, hoping to make it home by 3 a.m. The first couple of hours were uneventful. The road was quiet, with only the occasional semi-truck passing by. The sky was clear, the stars bright, and the hum of the engine was almost hypnotic. But then, something strange happened. I passed the same diner twice. At first, I didn't think much of it. The desert highways have a way of looking the same after a while, and I figured I was just imagining things. But 20 minutes later, I saw the diner again. It was unmistakable, a small, run-down building with a neon sign flickering above the door. The parking lot was empty, and the lights inside were dim, casting long shadows across the lot. I pulled over, my heart racing. Had I missed a turn? Was I driving in circles? I checked the GPS, but the screen was frozen, the blue dot stuck in the middle of nowhere. My phone had no signal, and I couldn't even pull up a map. Frustrated, I decided to stop at the diner and ask for directions. As I stepped out of the car, the air felt colder than it should have for a desert night. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint buzz of the neon sign. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally. Inside, the diner was empty. The tables were covered in a thin layer of dust, and the stools at the counter were slightly askew, as if whoever had been sitting there had left in a hurry. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. I walked to the counter, noticing a half-empty coffee cup sitting there. The liquid inside was cold, the surface stained with oil. A strange smell lingered in the air, metallic, almost like rust. As I turned to leave, I noticed something odd. There was a mirror on the far wall, cracked and dirty, its surface warped with age. In the dim light, I saw my reflection, but something about it was wrong. I moved, waving a hand, but the reflection didn't follow. It stood perfectly still, staring at me with eyes that weren't mine. A loud noise shattered the silence, a clatter, like something falling in the kitchen. I spun around, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaking. The kitchen door swung open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I didn't wait to see what was inside. I bolted out of the diner, the door slamming shut behind me as I ran to my car. The highway was empty as I sped away, my hands trembling on the wheel. But as I drove, I began to notice something strange. The mile markers on the side of the road weren't changing. No matter how far I went, the numbers stayed the same. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the same barren landscape repeating like a loop. My chest tightened as panic set in. I floored the gas, desperate to break free of whatever was happening. That's when I saw the diner again. It appeared out of the darkness like a mirage, its flickering neon sign glowing faintly in the night. I swerved, nearly losing control of the car as I pulled over. The diner was exactly the same as before, down to the half-empty coffee cup on the counter. But this time, there was someone inside. Through the window, I saw a figure sitting at one of the tables. It was a man, his head bowed as if he were staring at something in his lap. I honked the horn, hoping to get his attention, but he didn't move. Reluctantly, I got out of the car and approached the diner, my heart pounding with every step. The door creaked open, and the man looked up. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and sunken. He smiled faintly as I entered, his lips cracked and dry. "You're stuck too, huh?" he said, his voice low and raspy. I froze, my blood running cold. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man gestured to the window, his expression unreadable. "There's no way out," he said. "The road doesn't end." I turned to look outside, my heart sinking as I saw the highway stretching endlessly into the darkness. "I've been here for, I don't know how long," the man continued. "Days? Weeks? Time doesn't work here." I stumbled back, shaking my head. "This isn't real," I said, my voice trembling. It's just a bad dream." The man laughed, a dry, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "That's what I thought too," he said. "But you'll see. It doesn't matter how far you drive. You'll always end up back here." I bolted out of the diner, his laughter echoing in my ears. The car roared to life as I sped down the highway, the diner disappearing into the darkness behind me. But no matter how far I went, the road never changed. And eventually, the diner appeared again. I don't know how long I drove that night. All I know is that eventually, I stopped trying to escape. When I woke up, I was parked on the side of the highway, the sun rising over the desert. The diner was gone, the road ahead clear and empty. To this day, I don't know what happened or how I got out. But every time I pass a lonely diner on the highway, I feel a chill run down my spine, because I know that somewhere out there, the endless loop is still waiting. Driving at night has always been my favorite way to travel. The empty roads, the cool air, and the solitude create a calm that's hard to find during the day. But one night, while traveling through the southern plains, that peace was shattered by an encounter I'll never forget. It was October 2022, and I was driving from Dallas to Oklahoma City for a work trip. I'd left later than I planned and found myself cruising down a deserted highway well past midnight. The sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the road shrouded in darkness. The first half of the drive was uneventful, but as I passed a weathered sign for a small, unnamed town, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air inside the car felt heavier, and the hum of the tires on the asphalt seemed unnaturally loud. I shook off the unease and focused on the road, my eyes scanning the empty stretch ahead. Then, in the distance, I saw something. A shadowy figure stood on an overpass, barely illuminated by the faint glow of my headlights. As I got closer, the figure came into focus, a woman, standing perfectly still, her arms at her sides. She wore a long, dark dress, her hair hanging loose and obscuring her face. I slowed down, squinting to get a better look. There was no car, no sign of how she'd gotten there. Just as I passed beneath the overpass, her head turned sharply, following my car with an unnatural precision. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was gone. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, my tired mind playing games. But the uneasy feeling lingered, a heavy knot in my chest. 15 minutes later, I saw her again. This time, she was standing on the shoulder of the road, her figure partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. I slowed down, my heart racing. As my headlights illuminated her face, I felt a jolt of terror. Her eyes were wide and empty, her expression blank. She didn't move as I passed, her head slowly turning to follow my car. I pressed the gas, my hands trembling on the wheel. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the trees on either side forming a tunnel that seemed to close in with every mile. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint whistle of the wind. Then, the radio crackled to life. The static was loud and jarring, breaking the oppressive silence. I reached for the dial, trying to turn it off, but the static only grew louder, filling the car with its relentless hiss. Suddenly, a voice cut through the noise. "Stop the car," it said, low and distorted. I froze, my hand hovering over the dial. The voice repeated itself, louder this time. "Stop the car." My heart pounded as I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting in the back seat. But the back seat was empty. I slammed the radio off and gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights flickered and died, plunging the car into darkness. Panic set in as I coasted to a stop, the engine sputtering and falling silent. The highway was pitch black, the surrounding trees swaying gently in the wind. I fumbled for my phone, its screen casting a faint glow in the darkness. But as I turned it on, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. She was standing in the middle of the road, directly in front of the car. Her hair hung limply over her face, her dress billowing slightly in the breeze. I locked the doors, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She began to move, her steps slow and deliberate as she approached the car. I tried to start the engine, my hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine sputtered, refusing to come to life. She was closer now, her pale face visible through the windshield. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Desperation took over, and I slammed my fists against the steering wheel. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, swerving around her as the car sped forward. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then, she appeared in the rearview mirror. She was sitting in the back seat, her face inches from mine, her hollow eyes locked on me. I screamed, swerving wildly as the car careened off the road and came to a screeching halt. When I turned around, the back seat was empty. I sat there, shaking, the engine idling softly. The highway was silent again, the trees still and lifeless. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and parked beneath the fluorescent lights. The clerk looked up as I stumbled inside, my face pale and my hands trembling. "You okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "There was a woman," I stammered, "on the road. She followed me." The clerk's expression darkened. "You were driving past the old overpass, weren't you?" he said. I nodded, confusion and fear swirling in my chest. "They say she's been haunting that stretch for years," he continued. "Some story about a woman who, well, didn't make it across the bridge. People see her, and she follows them." I didn't ask any more questions. I just thanked him, bought a coffee, and sat in my car until the sun rose. To this day, I avoid that stretch of highway, especially at night, because I know that somewhere out there, she's still waiting, watching for the next car to pass.